He's a student at Pikes Peak Community College, studying social work and works full-time as a chef at UCCS. He serves on the board of directors of Pikes Peak Justice and Peace Commission, which is dedicated to solving social issues locally and globally. On this commission, Jimi is the chairperson of the Middle East Peace Project, which educates and provides humanitarian aid for Palestine through nonviolence. Perhaps most importantly today, he is an avid admirer of the work of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Jimi's essay is titled, Is Nonviolent Direct Action a Good Method to End Segregation and Racism?
All right, so first I'll give a little brief intro into what the paper is about. So in the spring of 1963, as most of you probably know, Martin Luther King Jr. was jailed in Birmingham, Alabama after leading a peaceful demonstration. A group of 8 clergymen together reprimanded King in public for being in Birmingham and for stirring up all this unwanted conflict. The 8 clergymen, comprising of both Christian and Jewish faiths, made a public statement denouncing King's acts, and in response, King gave his rebuttal via this now very famous letter from the Birmingham jail. This excerpt from my paper outlines the reasons that nonviolent direct action works, is necessary, and is the only way. And so here it is. Nonviolent direct action is the only method to end segregation and racism. A public statement by 8 Alabama clergymen is a letter that was written on April 12, 1963 to denounce the acts of nonviolent protest led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in Birmingham, Alabama. The clergymen asked that both the white and the Negro communities observe the principles of law and order and common sense. The 8 clergymen called MLK's acts untimely and unwise. Untimely because of the new local government that was just elected. They called MLK an outsider and said that this problem needed to be addressed by the local government and the local leaders. The clergymen believed that even though these protests were technically nonviolent, they created hate and violence in the community. The clergymen believed that these issues should be handled in the court and not in the streets. Hatred and violence have no sanction in our religious and political traditions, they wrote, repeating a sentiment formerly pointed out in another letter. The clergymen labeled the acts of MLK as extreme measures, which are not justified in Birmingham. During the 1960s, America saw a mobilization of the African American population to end racism and segregation, specifically in the South. Martin Luther King Jr. successfully rallied people in the name of peace, love, and justice. Nonviolent direct action was necessary in order to bring about thoughtful and responsive negotiations between the majority white government and the minority oppressed African American population. Throughout the 1960s, this mobilization took form in many different shapes. But in Alabama, MLK led with Christian principles through the shape of nonviolent demonstrations, civil disobedience, and sit-ins. These methods were termed nonviolent direct actions. These actions were the only alternative to the broken negotiations that occurred earlier. The actions were only performed after nonviolent training was properly given, and the actions follow in the footsteps of both Jewish and Christian teachings. In September of 1962, merchants of Birmingham said that they would take down humiliating racial signs. Because of this agreement, the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights agreed to stop demonstrations as a sort of truce. A few signs briefly were removed, then returned. The others remained. This was the type of response the African American peace movement continued to get from the majority white people. At this point, there was no alternative left but to prepare for direct action. If the promise would have been held up by the merchants of Alabama, there would have been no reason for direct action. this issue was self-inflicted. MLK asked that the clergymen not dwell on the effects of the problem, but the problem itself. The 8 clergymen saw the direct nonviolent action as a way to stir up hatred and violence, though it did the opposite. MLK wanted to create this sort of tension between the two groups, which was necessary for growth and negotiation to take place. MLK said, "The purpose of our direct action program is to create a situation so crisis-packed that it will inevitably open the door to negotiation. Too long has our beloved Sutherland been bogged down in tragic effort to live in monologue rather than in dialogue. This tension building would break at some point into dialogue and negotiation in a peaceful manner. In the time period in which this was written, there was already a lot of tension between the white population and the black population in Alabama, as conditions were by no means humane for African Americans. So this method of building upon that tension was a good, solid method that could and would work. This tension was built up through the direct action of the nonviolent campaign led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The final claim by the 8 clergymen in their letter was that Martin Luther King was using extreme measures. They wrote, "We do not believe that these days of new hope are days when extreme measures are justified in Birmingham. However, these measures were by no means extreme. These nonviolent actions were carefully and strategically planned out by MLK and his associates. During the planning, MLK taught people about nonviolence, how to practice it, as he stated to the clergymen in his letter. We began a series of workshops on nonviolence, and we repeatedly asked ourselves, are you able to accept blows without retaliating? The plan to use direct action was not taken lightly or in extreme form. As for being called an extremist, after thinking about this, Martin Luther King Jr. sort of liked this idea. Was not Jesus an extremist for love? Love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you. Since the accusers that MLK is speaking to are men of God, it is important that they realize that even though these actions were not actually extreme, if they want to characterize them as such, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was okay with that. King listed Jesus, the disciple Paul, Martin Luther, John Bunyan, Abraham Lincoln, and Thomas Jefferson as extremists for the good. He challenges the moderates then and perhaps now to this day, exclaiming, the question is not whether we will be extremists, but what kind of extremists we will be. Thank you.